Welcome, thank you. Welcome back to Groundswell, or as we like to call it now, Glastonbury. Isn't it good? Isn't it really, really good to be back? I don't know about you. I am so thrilled to be back. It's been a heck of a year for all of us, for lots of us in different ways. And now here we are back amongst our people, hanging out with the cool kids. Somebody here on the stage is one of those. All that brilliant energy and passion and enthusiasm, people just getting on and working out how to do the right thing. So well done, everybody. And this is the start of another couple of brilliant days together. When I started at FFCC back in 2017, which was then just supposed to be a 2-year independent inquiry on the future of food farming in the countryside, we were told in no uncertain terms, you can talk about lots of things, but you can't talk about land. Don't talk about land. Land is very triggering in England. Nobody wants to talk about land, and if you start talking about land, you'll lose the room. You won't be able to do the work that you need to do. So initially, I took that advice, and then realized, of course, that it's absolutely impossible to talk about all of the things that we need to do to tackle the climate crisis, to tackle the nature crisis, to tackle the health and inequalities crises in the UK, and to create flourishing rural communities with viable farm businesses at their heart. So I took on that challenge, and with lots of people in this conversation, actually, we took on that challenge 8 years ago to find a way of talking about land, a way that was inclusive, that involved all of the different stakeholders who've got literally a stake in how we make land use decisions, and to find a way through that impasse so we could start having the conversations that we needed about land, land use, and land use decision making. And now, here we are, opening Groundswell with this brilliant panel who've all been involved in these conversations for the last 5-6 years. And with a government that launched its consultation on land use back in January, I'm sure all of you will have contributed to that through the mechanisms, and we'll be hearing the results of that in the next couple of months. So still all to play for. Going out for a consultation and then making sense of all of those responses is quite the thing in the civil service. There'll be a lot of different responses, a lot of different comments, a lot of different perspectives, all piling in on what is a really critical topic. And they're going to have to work out how to navigate their way through all of it. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about here on the stage is how we can help this government and their officials be as ambitious and as brave and as bold as we think they can be, as we think people want them to be. So enough from me. My phenomenal panel on the stage with me today got Hilary McGrady, who is Chief Executive of the National Trust, one of the biggest landowners in the UK, with, is it 1,600 tenant farmers, with all sorts of interests on, with, and through land. Got Tom Bradshaw, NFU President and farmer in Essex, no rain in Essex at all. Brilliant Dustin Benton, who is now working for a consultancy, Foresight, but many of you will know him through his work with Green Alliance and working with Henry Dimbleby on the National Food Strategy, where he contributed a great chunk of material around land use frameworks, and rock god extraordinaire, Groundswell's resident DJ and farmer and pioneer of a brilliant brand that's lifting so many farmers, Andy Cato. So I'm going to start with you, Hilary, if I may. It's been a heck of a year, hasn't it, for farmers, land managers. We had the land use consultation in January, then we had the spending review just a couple of couple of months ago. I lose track of time. Was it a couple of months ago or was it just a month ago?
Not very long.
A few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And there's been quite a lot of, quite rightly I think, a lot of anxiety that it just doesn't feel like there's enough resource to go around for all of the things that we need to do on land, with land. So if you were advising government right at this moment in time and you really wanted them to bring into being a very ambitious land use framework, how would you encourage them to use the resources that are available to them, that we do have available?
Thank you. So there's never enough money to go around. Let's be honest, that never has there been a time where we think there's enough money. But I would say there was a collective sigh of relief, actually, I think, that the budget was not as bad as we were expecting. Not brilliant, not as bad as we were expecting. It still falls considerably short of what we think we need to restore nature, certainly. Our own research, along with RSPB and others, identified that we need 3 billion to be able to restore nature to the levels that would potentially get us to what the government themselves have set as targets within the environmental plan. Nonetheless, 2 billion, I think, broadly speaking, I think to be fair, Defra has done a good job. Nonetheless, we need to now figure out how to make best use of that funding. And we and others have been, we've worked for years to support the notion of a land use framework, but also to support the idea that public funds go to public goods. And of course, public goods do include food production, but we need a balance across all of the needs of our land. We live on an island. Land is incredibly precious in every sense, and it has to deliver so many different functions. But clearly, as we see nature in such catastrophic decline, we need to be very serious about what investment goes into ensuring that we can restore nature. And so we do think the framework of the 3 levels actually could and should work. SFI being one, the countryside higher tier, and landscape recovery. And we know, broadly speaking, how those need to be divided. We know that SFI is going to be needed to incentivise more farmers, and farmers will be central to ensuring the outcomes that we're after here in terms of nature. So we need SFI to work really hard to ensure that more people, more farmers are incentivised to get into the scheme. But the higher tier, the countryside higher tier scheme, is absolutely essential for those farmers who really want to go further, who really want to be rewarded for the work that they've already done, but want to stretch further. And then, of course, the landscape recovery, for me, is the one that will make the biggest difference to nature recovery. That is where we will get more bang for our buck, as it were. So I guess we're going to be calling on the government to really make sure that they get those levels right. We know that clearly it's frustrating, and farmers are having a hard time. I recognise that they are absolutely having a really hard time, and we consistently call for government to support farmers to make a profitable living. However, we need to ensure that that money is going to the landscape recovery schemes to ensure that we do get the best chance for nature recovery that's possible.
We end up talking a lot about Defra, don't we, in this space, and quite rightly, because Defra is leading on the land use framework. But clearly, decisions that we make about land are really material to other government departments too, like DESNES, the Department for Net Zero, like MHCLG, Business and Trade, and probably Treasury, actually, when we start thinking about it. So where do you think the opportunities are to work with other government departments to bring them into this sense of mission about making better decisions?
Yeah, completely. Otherwise, this is going to be a nice-to-have thing that sits on the edge of the shelf. For sure, every department that has some part to play in terms of land use allocation needs to be part of this. I mean, whether that's an integrated cross-departmental forum that's set up, whether there's champions put within each of the departments, they certainly need an actual mechanism, someone who's responsible for ensuring that each of those different interests, and they're all valid, but that debate needs to be happen in a transparent way so that we can see, and actually against each of the government's own targets. Again, I go back to the environmental plan. They've set targets. They need to be able to explain how to get there, and the land use framework is one of the mechanisms, only one, but one of the very important mechanisms to see how that can be delivered. But the other departments need to understand what that is and need to feel as if they have a part in it.
Do you think there's a risk that different government departments are not fully aligned. I'm thinking about the kind of anti-bat, anti-newt sentiments that were expressed out of MHCLG just a few months ago, which seemed needlessly persecutory to bats and newts.
It's really unhelpful, deeply unhelpful, and we've certainly been saying that the idea that you have to have an enemy and picking on a bat as your enemy seems a bit pathetic, frankly. But I think the bigger challenge is that I'm not sure that even all the other departments are even aware of the land use framework. I don't think that they're really necessarily bought into the concept of it now. So we're starting, I applaud them for producing it, but we're at a very low level. And it's in consultation. That's the point of the consultation exercise, isn't it? But unless you get the other departments to play their part in this, it isn't actually going to work.
Yeah, thank you. Tom, I'm going to come to you now. There's a big piece in the framework about taking 9% of land out of production. You and I have already had a conversation today about yields this year and how climate and weather has had a massive impact on the productive capacity of the land. How are you seeing the features of the land use framework that was being consulted on?
I think initially we need to try and lift this up a level and say, take a global picture and say, actually, what is the geopolitical situation looking like around the world? And I don't think in my lifetime we've ever seen a geopolitical situation as it is today. You then look at the real impacts of climate change, both globally and also domestically. And you can see the pressure the world is under to producing the calories and the food that are required for the 9 or 10 billion, whatever it's going to become. And I think to begin with, we have to look at that big holistic picture and say, actually, what is the UK's role in this? And within the manifestos, which a year ago were so important when people were about to go and make a decision, there was the line in the Labour manifesto about food security as national security. Yet so far, I wouldn't see we've seen any policy hung from that, which is meaningfully going to deliver a change and prioritise food production. And our concern, I guess, is that the most productive land, if you said that's the head, that'll always produce food. The danger with the 9% is that you start taking the shoulders out of production. And the shoulders are where you're going to get the more consistency. You need that resilience. You need the food system to have a broad resilience to it. And if you rely on just the most productive land day in, day out, and then you have a challenge, and that remainder isn't producing food, then in times of challenge, there's going to be a real problem when it comes to the food security. And when we look within the land use framework and you take the 9%, we've got some major concerns about the underlying assumptions that have been made. This 0.5% per year productivity growth, you only get there if you go back to the 1970s. If you look at the last 20 years, we haven't had that productivity growth. And yet the assumption is that we will be able to have the productivity growth at 0.5% per year. Now, we would all love to see that, but what basis, what evidence is there that we can get a 0.5% per year productivity growth? The other concern is that we are expecting a 10% population increase over the next 25 years. How are we going to produce the food for that increasing population? What is the UK's role in that? And making sure that we have a resilient food system for 70 million, 77 million consumers here in 25 years' time is an absolutely crucial role. And will the land use framework frustrate or will it support? And I think at the moment, we don't have the evidence as to how that is going to happen.
Let's talk about decision-making about land use, because I think one of the things that I've always been very nervous about some interpretations of a land use framework is it kind of assumes that boffins in Whitehall will have a lovely map of the UK and they'll work out what we'll be able to do where. And I don't know about you, but on my farm at the moment, we are changing our plans right now because the land is changing. And so I'm wondering how you see the relationship between national targets and the ability of farmers and land managers to be able to make kind of dynamic and responsive decisions on their land based on the prevailing conditions at the time. What's going on right now?
I think you've got to empower the business manager, the decision maker, to be able to make those decisions. And being too prescriptive in a central plan as to how land is going to be used is going to end up with really perverse outcomes. Because one of the variances we see here in the UK compared to continental climates, if you went to the US, is that we have huge variability in our farming systems. You'll all look at your neighbours or somebody 10 miles away, they'll have a completely different farming system to you. So something that spatially, you may be in an area on a map which says you should be doing this, but at a localized level, the range of what farmers are doing is absolutely huge. And whether that be, I could go 2 miles from home and they'll be growing potatoes on some very, very fertile grade 1 land, whereas we're farming some Hounslow series clay. And so if you try and do that from a top-down approach and you don't empower the decision makers, then you're going to end up with a hideous mess, to be honest with you. So you've got to have the power to make decisions at a local level. Yeah,
brilliant. Thank you. Dustin, I'm going to come to you now, because you and I have debated this topic a lot, haven't
Yes.
we? About the relationship between what are national critical targets, how do we meet our climate obligations and our nature recovery goals, whilst at the same time recognising, as we see it at FFCC, we see a land use framework almost as a basis for democratic renewal in places for thinking about how we use land in places much more effectively. How have you kind of reconciled that dilemma between the big strategic decisions that need to be made by government and how we implement those decisions in places all around the country?
That is the killer question, but I want to start, if you don't mind,
with a different question. That's fine.
No, I will come to your question, but I would start from saying you need to start from the numbers and then work out what the numbers permit you, because there's tons of choice within the numbers, but we've got to get those in our minds. And I have an exhibit to share with the audience, so if I could go next slide, please. We have modeled what business as usual looks like, what carrying on farming the way we do now looks like. This is a complicated graphic, but the key thing you need to look at is that little dashed line through the middle. On the left of it is less, on the right of it is more. And if we carry on farming the way we do, what we find is we don't meet our climate targets and we don't meet our nature targets. And in order to kind of force our climate targets, we spill land overseas. And that probably means we destroy nature overseas. So the bars on the bottom there show nature at 2030 and nature at 2050. They're in decline. Overseas land use is the second one. That top farmland thing is using it as we do today. I want to show another slide, which is the, next slide please, which is what I think good would look like. I worked closely with a colleague, Lydia Collis, on modeling out what a land use framework could look like. And here we're using land in different ways. So you've got conventional farming in that green in the very top bar there. Then you've got agroecology or regenerative agriculture, which is the largest slice in the middle there. And then you have, leaving land for nature or making wild habitats. And if you change how land is used, you can not only reduce the UK's reliance on land overseas, but also nearly double nature by 2050 and meet our climate targets. Now, the reason I share these numbers with you is that absolutely we've got to think about what happens at the local level. You will know better on your land to do, how to do the best with it than anyone else, I'm sure. We've got to fit it into this national framework. So third slide, please, and then I promise I won't slide the audience.
Very slidey, Dustin.
It is, but I thank you, audience, for bearing with me. This is the government's proposal. I've just taken the land use change because they haven't released the numbers, so I couldn't do the modeling for the nature outcomes and all the rest of it. But I guess the key takeaway is that top bar is 2050, the middle bar is 2030. These are very modest changes, very small changes in what we want from the land. And I think the message for me here is that probably we will need to see more land use change to meet our food, nature, and climate targets. And perhaps the most interesting question for this audience, which is about the individual farmer making choices on their land, doing multifunctionality, is how can you demonstrate to the government that's thinking in numbers and isn't thinking so much in place that what you do with your land can deliver on those big nature, climate, food outcomes? Because that's the way to grow that light blue bit, which is the regenerative agriculture bit of the system. So I think that is what I would ask of this audience. What the government needs, to answer your question, is much more experimentation. I mean, I was the man in Whitehall, and I can tell you the man in Whitehall needs data and feedback to pay attention to what you out there farming and managing land are telling them about what land can do, about how much more nature it can support, about what kind of food it can grow. And that dynamic feedback will allow us to reconcile the kind of big, if you're chief rock star, I'm chief nerd, the big kind of nerdy things that I'm presenting you here with the lived reality of how you actually manage land, how you deal with a drought, how you make the best of the good times.
So I'm going to press you on that just for a moment longer, because I love a number just as much as the next person. I don't love that. No, I love some good data, really, really good data. But I always ask myself the question, so whose evidence counts here? Whose data counts? And in places, you're having to, one is having to reconcile lots of different data, lots of different issues, lots of different metrics. And in my experience, again, I love a civil servant as much as the next person. Hell, some of my best friends are civil servants, literally.
My best friend,
However, I know, and I think they will say the same thing, that when you're in Whitehall, it is both quite hard to be as brave and courageous as you might really like to be, because politics is complicated. But you often get and can feel very distant from the material reality of delivery in places. And you know, a phrase I use often, a strategy without the capacity for implementation is just deception. So the relationship between a government strategy, which is really, really important to set the guardrails, and the capacity for implementation is going to have to reside somewhere else. So will you agree with me at last, Dustin, that regional land use frameworks, local land use frameworks are really integral to the delivery of our ambition?
I think we need a means of feeding up from the local or the regional level to the national. And the reason why I showed you a bar chart, which is really, really simple, rather than attempting to draw a map, is precisely your point. You know, I could build you a map top down and tell you what's the clay soil type and all that kind of stuff. But you would quite quickly come back and say, well, your map says this, but let me tell you what the reality of, or you will tell me, let me tell you about the reality of what I can do with my farm. I guess the reason why I'm saying that is that it's this dynamic, it's this back and forth between this is what I can do with my land, this is what the country wants, the country needs, or what the country will pay for, and making the land use framework happen is that back and forth process, I think.
Can I just come in with a really quick example? Because recently there was some peatland mapping done of Dartmoor, and rocky outcrops were showing as 80% peat. And that's what happens if we centralize everything, if we don't ground truth it, if we don't trust the data and the evidence, suddenly we lose faith in the whole system because something is presented which is just blatantly wrong. And so the data really, really matters. And having that local feed-in is the way that we're going to end up with something that works.
Yeah, brilliant. So I'm just going to come to Andy for a sec. Andy, can I ask you, did you want to respond or shall I ask you my question?
You ask away, yeah.
Or do you want to respond?
No, carry on.
So your day job is now working with the material reality of lots of farmers trying to adopt more regenerative practices. In fact, trying to make that big central section in Dustin's bar chart, that big middle regenerative piece, to make it work, to make it viable. Do you see a relationship between the work that you're trying to do to bring more farmers into a viable, economically viable, regenerative space and a land use framework?
Yeah, I do. And I think we've also just got to recognise that this is a classic example of these collective complex problems that short-term democracies and capitalism and capitalist societies is very hard to solve. And so I think it's a big tribute to Henry and the National Food Strategy, all the people involved bringing this stuff together for all the imperfections, because we've got to start understanding the question in order to be able to answer it. And it's just, the data is obviously critical, and I think our ability to measure farm outcomes data is the key point here, which I'll come back to in a second. But it's also, it goes beyond data, doesn't it? Because I was thinking on the way here, it's broadly, and obviously exceptions to this, but broadly acceptable to chop down a forest to build a railway line, and broadly unacceptable to buy some farmland back to plant a forest. Why? You know, and I think it's because we're asking people to leave cultures and callings and deep-seated traditions, and so that whether that's the uplands or fishermen, I saw it firsthand in the miners' strike in Yorkshire. So I think framing this as a collective sense of mission and purpose, and there's no more fundamental mission because no species survives the death of its ecosystem, is really important. So from a wild farm perspective, the economic case for farmers is critical. But it's also, what we've found is being part of this community and this mission and a traceable supply chain, so you've got a direct link to your consumers who are buying your food. And from this stated mission, you get all kinds of people going the extra yard up and down the supply chain to make this stuff happen. So I think it's how this is framed is critical.
Yeah. I mean, you are talking to a miner's daughter from the Rhondda Valley. And so we were probably both having similar experiences in those days. And I think one of the lessons I learn every day when I'm at home is that big decisions, probably made for broadly the right reasons, closing coal mining, has had unintended consequences for 40 years that those communities are still living with. So I wonder how we're going to persuade this government to learn those lessons, that decisions we make on land use and land use change and investing now for the right kind of land use change is as material as the big decisions they get quite excited about in terms of industrial strategy and economic strategy. So how do we shift the way we talk about this so it really lands with the concerns with this government?
Well, I think there's a really good news story in your blue bar there, your light blue bar, because when we talk about what's in scope and not in scope, the way we farm, as it stands, isn't in scope in the land use framework. Yeah. And yet, we know that from wild farm fields relative to conventional fields last year, Bristol University were measuring what happened to insects. There was a doubling of insect biomass and a quadrupling of bees. So we've got to, I think, get away from this nature versus food shadow, which is still hanging over these discussions, because we can do so much of both in the same place at the same time.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. I'm going to come back to you for a second, Hilary, and just kind of illustrate really why a land use framework has to be multifunctional and has to be broad-based, because the National Trust is a steward of land, but is also a steward of the countryside, is a steward of heritage, many tenant farmers who are rooted in their communities. You're a prime driver in tourism. So are there ways that you can imagine a multifunctional land use framework will enable you to deliver on all of those priorities for the National Trust and indeed the national priorities too?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that there's one size fits all is nonsense. We all know that. You all know that, working in your own farms. And I guess what I'm hoping for from the land use framework is that it is an understanding, or a collective understanding, of what we are trying to achieve, what the overall outcome is that we are collectively trying to achieve, rather than places on a map. And I completely get that data is incredibly important to this, but everybody will have an argument about data always. So I guess what I'm looking for is a sense of, we are in this together, and what can we collectively do to make our land in the round be productive, be good for nature, be good for people, actually. Because it is fundamentally about people, actually, at the end of the day. These are people that are living on the land, making their livelihoods, but also making sure that other people have the well-being that comes from our land, that they have the food and all of those things. So you have to get to a place where you're trying to incentivize and reconnect people with why this matters. And that fundamental, and that applies right the way through from consumer behaviour to impacting on supply chains to impacting on what's made at our farms. So unless we get that balance right, that none of us are going to succeed. So the framework, in my view, gives an ambition for what we're trying to get to in terms of balance, but then it's on all of us to try to get everybody engaged in trying to achieve that outcome. As an organisation, 1,600 farms around the country, all doing different things. Some of it, most of it, actually very marginal land, but I take your point about the shoulders, as it were. But it's more than just what they farm, it's their cultural inheritance that's also part of this. Mm-hmm. So we have to find a way to get those things to balance. But I entirely agree that that has to be something that feels like a local decision. They're the people that understand their land and what they're doing the best. But unless you have it plugged in to a national ambition, actually, we won't succeed. So it is a really tricky balance to ensure that both are happening at all of times. But surely that's our job. Surely that's our job individually and collectively to play our part into something that's bigger.
Mm. That's really helpful. Somebody told me about a conversation that she'd had with a farmer a couple of weeks ago, and she said it was quite a surprising conversation. She was talking to somebody who was saying, well, climate change can't be real, because if climate change was real, then surely the government would ask us as farmers to do something about it, because we're the ones who can. And that was a really, really interesting revelation for me, the idea that if it was real, they would ask us, because we can do something about it. And Tom, I was just coming back to you. I'm going to talk about water, because a land use framework, a multifunctional land use framework, will also talk about how on earth we manage the situations of water at the moment. We've got too much water at times. We've got risks of flooding. Chances are we'll get flooding. If it rains hard on solid ground in the next few weeks, we're going to get flooding. But also, we've experienced masses of drought in the last few months. The National Infrastructure Commission made a proposition not so long ago that investing directly with farms to encourage farmers to do a lot more water storage and water movement would be a really good thing. Is that the kind of thing that you think farmers can participate in, they can get involved in to tackle that crisis, but also demonstrate how central we are to national critical issues?
Can I come to water in a second?
Yes,
I just want to
answer another question.
I just want to pick up the culture and the heritage part, because the culture and the heritage part is absolutely vital. And these thriving rural businesses, of which farming and food production will be a key element, but keeping those people at the heart of communities is something which is so important. And you touched on that, Hilary. But if we think about the Dartmoor fires of 2 months ago, the people that put those fires out were the commoners, were the farmers. The fire brigade couldn't get there. And if you don't have that community at the heart of these landscapes, then what happens over time is you lose the knowledge, you lose the skills, and you lose the ability to react and to respond. And so I think we do have to put a real value on culture and heritage. It's not to mean that the landscapes can't change, but making sure the people are at the heart of that is absolutely essential to long-term success. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to create an environment which doesn't have that heart. And that is going to be so important as we move forwards. Yeah. Just on water, it is absolutely crazy that trying to get planning permission for a reservoir can take 2 years. I have an example of a farm who is on the coast. The water that goes through his farm is pumped over the seawall. Built a reservoir 4 years ago. He cannot get permission to take the water that is pumped over the seawall to fill his reservoir. This is the world gone absolutely mad. Now, the planning system is broken. And if we're going to start to unlock the opportunities, but also build resilience, we've got to say, how can we be far more dynamic in enabling change? And moving from summer abstraction to winter abstraction, generally a good thing. Permitted development rights for reservoirs, why not? They're going to provide a habitat. They're going to reduce the pressure on our natural environment. They're going to build resilience into our farming systems and into our food systems. And yet it can be, it can take over 2 years to get permission. We've got to get better join up here so that we really can, again, empower people to make a difference, because at the moment, the system stops us. The system is a block, and then we wonder why we're forever chasing our tail to try and feel like we're in charge and that we can adapt as quickly as we need to. So soil management has a massive role to play in water holding capacity. We all know that, and I don't need to tell people in this audience in particular, but how we try and build our organic matters, how we make sure that our land is able to absorb that water, and it is absolutely essential as well, another critical element to it. So yes, farming absolutely is central to this, but we need to get rid of some of the rigidity which sits around the structures and really enable a much more pragmatic approach to how we manage water for the long term. And if we suddenly, in 6 weeks, or over the next 6 weeks, if we've got rivers in flood, why can't we abstract out of those rivers for 36 hours? Because the system says no. But we should say, we've got excess water. Let's take it. Let's fill the reservoirs. We've been using them for the last 4 months. We didn't expect to. So there's so many times here where an element of pragmatism, and look, that's what farming's great at, is being pragmatic. An element of pragmatism could really trump the system here if we enable that sort of fleet of foot thinking.
That's a brilliant example of why multifunctional thinking is central, but also why any land use framework has to be in dynamic relationship between what's actually happening on the ground and big global intentions. So I'm going to come back to you, Dustin, and draw a little bit on your experience of being inside the civil service. And we know it's really, really hard, even within departments, to get different groups of civil servants with different priorities talking to each other, and it's incredibly difficult between departments. So what did you learn? What lessons would you have to share about how to get different departments working together more effectively to pick up these sorts of issues that we've just talked about, Hilary and Tom have just talked about them, but that actually sit with different government departments?
I would say talking between different officials is very easy. Making decisions is hard. That's my experience anyway. I guess to directly answer the question, you need a shared goal. And I think that that's why the climate targets, the nature targets, they are a shared goal in legislation. If you're a civil servant, you do follow the law, you seek to enable the law, and they will be driving some of the decision. So if I were back in Defra and I was talking to MHCLG about the planning issue you are describing, why can't we build reservoirs and fill them in perfectly sensible times? I'd be saying, look, we've got a legal target on water quality, and how do we achieve this shared goal, and also how does it reduce costs that might accrue to local authorities? That would be the mechanism by which I would do that. It's all very inside baseball, though. The thing that civil servants struggle with is that feedback from what happens in the real world back into Whitehall. And the reason why I started with data is that data can help democratize the decisions. If you're getting your evidence base from the University of Bristol saying, well, we've got 4 times the number of bees on a farm that is managed in your way, then you can build it into the model and say, well, we need loads more bees for lots of really great reasons. How do I make sure that feeds back into what I'm thinking about, what the policy is framed as? That's the bit that is currently missing in policy, and one of the things I found most frustrating about the very good, in theory, environmental land management scheme. It was fixed, it was based on rules of thumb from 30 years ago, and it was trying to solve problems which were a kind of early 20th century problem. How do we produce as much food as possible to feed the world? Obviously, we got to still keep doing that, but the basis upon which the land system operates, the climate system, temperatures, nature, that's all shifting. And so we need our evidence base to reflect the fact that food security in the future is climate and nature security, and a landscape that is able to absorb water when it rains too much, not just how do we get 16 tons of wheat per hectare in the kind of maximally intensive, amazingly scienced kind of fields, which they can do in Northumberland, I'm told, which is incredibly impressive.
So I'm going to come back to you, Andy, and just pick on the supply chain for a moment.
Can I just say something about water?
Yes. Yeah, do.
Just because I think with water, it's a really good, coming into farming from the outside, and especially around this conversation, you hear this phrase about not telling farmers what to do. But it's looking from the outside in. It seems that for decades we've told farmers what to do, and that's to produce yield at all costs and get paid less than the cost of production for doing so. So this is a chance to, I hope, to support farmers to grow quality food from nature-rich landscapes. And I've yet to meet a farmer who would want to do that if they could make that work. And so how do we do that? We've got to have an economic model where you're not just paid for the number of tons, but you're paid for their quality and the quality of the ecosystem in which they're grown. And so when we bring that back to water, there are, I think it might be 6, it might be 7, water companies now that are paying wild farm growers directly significant sums of money. It does vary. It goes from 80 to 300 pounds a hectare. The moral of this story is move to Wessex and grow for wild farm, because I think it's 300 down there. But there are significant chunks of money, and they're doing that because they're getting a good return on investment in stopping pollution at source rather than dealing with it later. So this is just one example of how you can build a more holistic economic model that goes beyond tons. And in terms of sort of the physical infrastructure of water, I agree there'll be areas where that's important, but nothing can hold a candle to the increase in water storage and resilience that will come from even a small increase in soil organic carbon. So again, from a Treasury perspective, they're spending £2.5 billion protecting 60,000 properties from flooding. There's going to be 8 million properties at risk from flooding by 2050. The only affordable way to do that is to support farmers to build soil organic carbon. So you put that as another piece in the jigsaw, and you can see a way to farmers who are de-risked, because not all of their income depends on yield. And we're getting so many of the things that we need from this land use framework on productive land. Yeah.
Let's finish our session before we come to questions with a little bit of policy wonking, integrating policy wonking with what's going on farms. That illustration that you gave us just there is a brilliant example of how farmers are already thinking in systems. Government talks a lot about systems thinking, about joining up across boundaries, joining up across departments, about joining up in places. They struggle to do it. And yet, what you just described there, all of the stakeholders, all of the folk with real skin in the game in that place, with different interests and different priorities, being able to work together for really positive outcomes for farmers, for water companies, and for your supply chain, because you're showing up in all the places now, aren't you? So give us some clues about how you made that work, how your wild farm model made that kind of profoundly practical and yet quite radical project work in places.
You just don't sleep very much and keep going for years.
I can see that.
No, I think it's a you know, there's been various aspects to it. Obviously, without good farmer outcomes, there's nothing to talk about. So we have to start from there, and that's a work in progress, working with our community to find the sweet spot where all this fits together, and we review that every year. And so from building a farming community, kind of one field at a time, one farmer at a time, and then all the nightmarish complexity, which I won't even begin to bore you with, but to get that grain traceably through onto supermarket shelves or into restaurants or whatever it is. But once we'd unlocked that link between end users and farmers, and again, to go back to where I started, created the kind of sense of mission about all this and a sense of collective endeavor. Well, then that gives you a voice, but it also makes people want to get involved in that collective endeavor. And that's why I just think that the backing up the data or surrounding the data with like, what are we trying to get out of this? And the really exciting thing, I think, from our work over the last few years has been measuring the outcomes of farming systems. So in terms of water infiltration and nature and carbon and grain quality. And we can measure these now, and we can measure them in a way which is scalable and repeatable and affordable. And I think that is transformational in combining farmer flexibility with measured outcomes, because what you can measure, you can value. And the water companies are just the beginning of that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go to the audience now. I think I've done quite, oh, look, a little flurry of hands already. So I'm an old lady. I can't see what I'm doing. I can see Ben over there. Let's start with Ben, then we'll come there. And then have we got any women with their hands up? I can see, and Dimitri's not a woman. Have we got women in the audience? I know we have. Well, look, let's start with, Ben is over here. Where are my mic ladies? Hello, mic lady. Is Ben? We'll go there next. We'll come to Dimitri. And then we'll go there because it's easy. But where are the women? Excellent. I see Mary Ann. Go, Ben.
Thanks, T. One thing you've not mentioned yet is the local nature recovery strategy, which hasn't got a huge amount of coverage. I think is seen by, well, our local council put a meeting on at my farm. We had 5 other farmers turn up, and 4 of those was to say, I don't want my land included in it. So how do we communicate the opportunities from engaging with the local nature recovery strategy? And was there a reason it wasn't mentioned? It seems like a perfect way to communicate local knowledge up to a more national level.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time. We'll come back to that. Ben farms up the road from me, and we know those farmers who don't want to be involved in anything, don't we? But there are ways and means, aren't there? So next person here.
Thanks very much. Bill Herditch from Australia. Just a triggering point that Andy made was we've got to stop talking about food and opposed to nature. And my question really is, does the land use framework as currently published sort of breach that rule, because it's got all these sort of nature parts of its graph and it's got its food parts of its graph, and they're not interconnected at all. And I think there's an ideological problem here to say that we can have nature or food and not both. And how can we join that up more properly in the framework? Yeah.
Let's pick up those 2 questions first, because I think they relate really well. There are these things called local nature recovery partnerships that embed nature recovery in decision making, and then there's that question you said about, well, how do we join the dots? I'm going to come to you, Tom, I think, for that one first.
I'm going to start on the second question. And whether we like it or not, at the moment we have legislated environmental targets. We don't have legislated targets for food production. And nature, climate, is absolutely vital. But the poor relation at the moment is food production. And that is the one that can give to enable delivery of everything else. And that's fine in an abundant world. But if we end up in a place where calories are scarce, that becomes much, much more of a problem. And so let's put them on an equal platform so that every decision we're looking at the yin and the yang. What is the impact on both? And how do we really turn this into a multifunctional landscape where we're looking at both? What I really like about what Andy was saying is that it's underpinned by science and evidence. And I think we need science just as much as we've ever needed science to solve our problems. If we're willing to use the latest science to keep people alive, we need to use that same science to help feed people. But we need to integrate it with the systems that are going to deliver both. Not how, ultimately, what you talked about, Dustin, was a system post-Second World War, which was all about production. And we can look back at that now and we can say, oh, farmers, you were evil, you pulled out hedges.
Oh, no.
You paid us to pull out hedges. Yeah. You know, that's you didn't say that. No. You didn't say that. But somebody who's on a panel later on did say that when he was in government. And you know, but let's get this right now. What is it we want for the next 10, 15 years? I think the really big question is, how do we pick up the externalities of society? Because what we're looking at here is farming has got to deliver a system which is somehow paid for recognizing the externalities of food production. And at the moment, nobody is willing to pay for that. And who is it that's going to pay for that? The gap, the £2 billion gap. We need private finance to come into that to pick up the cost of these externalities, because these are societal externalities that farming has to solve the problem of. And where I'd probably, when we look at the local nature recovery strategies, these have been going on for 3 or 4 years, actually, the development of these. And they've drawn far more attention since the capabilities which are proposed within the Planning and Infrastructure Bill to give Natural England the power to use compulsory purchase powers. And I can't tell you as a farmer whether you're right to have your land in a local nature recovery strategy or whether you actually want your land outside it. If you are prioritizing income from the green and environmental markets, you're probably going to want your land in it. But then in the future, farmers are saying to me, does that mean Natural England will be able to compulsory purchase my farm? I can't answer that because I genuinely don't know the answer to it. So there's a lot of nervousness about what these local nature recovery strategies are actually going to mean if your land is or isn't inside the zones on the map. Mm-hmm. Again, that nervousness doesn't create the confidence which is required, because we've all seen a very stop-start transition for the last decade. What we need to know now is, what is the direction, where are we going, where's the funding going to come from, and then how are we going to build a system which takes us to where we're tasked with going. And that confidence will enable the investment which the whole industry needs to make, and the wider supply chain to enable that sort of delivery of that system.
Thank you, Tom. And Dustin, I'm going to let you respond to that question too. So LNRSs are the mechanism, or when they're better developed, are the mechanisms through which national targets are delivered locally. How do you see those fitting in with, connecting to, relating to a land use framework?
They're a bit floating off on their own is the honest answer. And that's like, mechanistically, that's because the state has a relationship with individual farmers through the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which bluntly is Defra, or the Rural Pavement Agency, to the individual farmer. What we don't have is a kind of collective process in that. And it feels to me like starting with what does the nation want and what does the local know, maybe you get there in the end, but I think it's suffered from not having much of a connection between those. But I want to come back to the thing about nature versus farming. I think we need to take a more sophisticated view. If you want a pine marten as a particular species, if you want a bittern, they don't grow on farmland. They need habitats that are basically wild. So if we start from saying all land must both be all farm and all nature, we are excluding the majority of the natural world. That's not what the kind of thing that I showed is. We need both. This is a both and strategy, not an either or. We need much more nature on farmland, but we also need the least productive farmland, the 20% of farmland that produces 3% of what we grow in the UK, to be allowed to be much better at nature and to reward the people who own and manage that land, because what we can't do is to have the next Highland clearances and ensure that people don't have a place in that land. So that's how I would answer that question.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a couple more questions. So Dimitri's got the microphone, then I'm going to come over to Marianne over there.
Thank you very much. A really fascinating conversation. My name is Dimitri Houthart. Question for Dustin. I actually love a bit of data, and I really like your slides, especially the middle one, because it tells a fantastic story of where we could be. I'm just curious, because there is one thing on the side that's mentioned 45% change in dairy and meat consumption. And I'm wondering, to achieve that vision you've shared, does that mean that we need a major dietary shift in the nation? And how do you think that can be achieved?
Good question. And let's take a question from Marianne as well. Marianne, you have to... Sorry, I'm making the mics run here.
Thank you. Really interesting session. Marianne O'Hotter, CPRE, the Countryside Charity. It's also about your bar graphs. As that light blue strip grows so that regen, agroecological farming becomes the new conventional farming, how does that impact the economics? Because at the moment, for some farm producers, there's a premium. So what happens when that becomes the convention?
Good question. So diet change, and the economics of farming. So it was directed at you, Dustin. I'm going to let you have a short amount of time, and then I'm going to bring Andy in to answer that question as well. Cool.
So on the, you're absolutely right. In order to make the sums add up, you need to have less meat and dairy consumption. Globally, we grow about 6,000 calories per person per day, and we harvest about 4,000 calories per person per day as grass, which we feed to animals, or grass or other human inedible stuff. So we've got this super abundance of calories. You know, we each need about 2,500 calories a day. What we do is we feed a lot of that to animals, and the most efficient land animal is a chicken. You get 100 calories of grain, you feed it to a chicken, you get 12 calories of edible chicken meat out of it. If it's a beef cow, you get 3 calories out. So we take this extraordinary surplus and we produce incredibly tasty. This is not an argument for veganism, but it's a pretty lossy conversion. And so in order to have more space for nature and more space for farming that does more than one thing on the land, something has to give. And in the model that we did, the give is we eat less meat and dairy. Not none, I don't think it's radical. We're already on a trajectory of lower meat and dairy consumption, but that has to change. And on the question on the kind of how do you make money in this system, I think Tom, you alluded to it, the supply chain will ultimately have to pay more if government is not going to pay more. Now, that doesn't mean that we subsidize farmers to do, or we ask supermarkets or whatever to pay more for the same units of food, but we do need a route, for example, like you were talking about with Wessex Water. Wessex Water has got to pay for the water quality benefits that farmers can provide. And we need the government to pay for nature benefits, and we need enlightened food companies that are worried about climate risks destroying their ability to grow food to invest in agriculture that is more resilient to the kind of climate change that we're already seeing. So that's where the extra money comes from.
So let's pick that up, because at the moment there's a bit of a paradox, isn't there? There is an argument that says regen, organics, has the same history, ought to have a premium attached to it in the marketplace. But then we're also saying we want regen farming, we want agroecological farming to really spread out, so that it's, you know, as the Sword Association's new slogan, organics for all. We want to see that spread right across the marketplace. So how do we square that particular circle? How do we grow the market for regenerative products and make sure that the supply chain and other stakeholders, as Andy's pointed out, start absorbing the costs that they currently externalise and pass them on to farmers, and make sure that food doesn't become so costly in the UK that it has huge social implications. So Andy first, and then I'll come to you, Tom.
I think there are different bits to it. So, you know, I think there are, again, you know, what do we mean by regenerative? We can't go into that now because we've got a few minutes left.
Yes.
But, you know, there's a degree to which nutrition based on need, the more efficient use of inputs. You know, there are lots of stories of people like John Kemp, for example, and the people that he's advising, or his team are advising, where you just become more profitable within a commodity corn and soybean system in their case, because you're using inputs better. So that's one bit of it. The second bit is the going above and beyond the more efficient use of inputs to creating water quality, water resilience, nature payments. Well, again, Now that we can measure these outcomes, now that we've got precedent for food-producing landscapes and food-producing farmers being paid for these ecosystem services whilst producing food, not instead of it, then clearly this is something that we need, I think, to build into the land use framework scope and open up all the opportunities to meet the targets whilst producing food at the same time that brings. And on a business level, we're having these kind of conversations all the time. If you take cocoa or olive oil or coffee, these supply chains are examples of what happens when wild weather hits degraded ecosystems. And cocoa production only went down 20%, and the price went up 260%. So if you'd gone to a big confectionery business 5 years ago and said, pay 30% more now and it will stay there, or you can pay 260% more if you don't get these ecosystems resilient.
Yeah.
That's, it's not an easy argument to win, but it's a powerful one, and there are more and more examples that allow us to make that case.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Tom, you've got so many different members in the NFU, haven't you? I'm an NFU member with my 52 acres, and then you've got huge members we're all trying to make a living out of different types of enterprise, different types of business, and we're all trying to grow food for a growing population. How do you think your members square the circle of being both viable and on a trajectory of more environmentally friendly farming?
I mean, I think there's an elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is we've got the third cheapest food in the world in the UK, but that becomes a massive social challenge. And how we square that circle is a really, really important one. There's also a political element to this, because no government is going to vote for higher food prices because of the short-term nature of electoral cycles. And yet, in reality, if we're going to pick up the externalities, the money has to come from somewhere. And farming has been bled dry. There isn't any more to give at a farm level. So we've got to work, how do we get the value out of the systems? And there's going to be multiple stakeholders in there. But I think trying to turn a niche mainstream and maintain a premium is going to be difficult, because the reason it has a premium ultimately is because it tends to be niche. Then you've got to look at where are the other markets, well, where's the other finance coming in from? And the water companies is a great example, but then from a government perspective, again, they don't join the dots on this. Suddenly the public are paying more for their water. And so how does this all work through the system and end up getting the proper financing? I mean, I just want to pick up on landscape recovery, because I do think this is a really critical element. But if we can't make private finance work in landscape recovery, where is private finance ever going to work? And I think that's a really genuine question, because we've been told already since 2016 that private finance is going to be the answer. We're seeing some examples of private finance coming in. But if it doesn't work for landscape recovery projects where the benefits should be very, very easy to measure, how will private finance ever really come to the rescue and be able to fund the gap?
Yeah, thank you. We're running out of time, so I'm going to come to you, Hilary, and then I'm going to ask you for a final sentence or two to sum up the conversation today. So you're going to get response plus sentence.
Okay, so I agree with all of that, but actually the one person that we haven't talked about here is actually the consumer. And you're quite right, from a social point of view, cheap food has become the norm. It's going to be hard to break, but actually the bigger challenge is that we have lost a connection between nature and people. That's a fundamental break that has happened over the last number of decades, that we have a responsibility to try to reconnect. More children recognise the McDonald's brand than recognise what a carrot is. That's a fundamental problem, from education right the way through the system, and how we engage people in where food comes from, why it matters. I'm not saying that that will necessarily deliver the premium that we're all looking for, but certainly it would be a very good start. And it seems to me that's fundamental to engaging people into the long-term sustainability of our food systems, as well as our farming and ultimately our nature restoration.
Brilliant, thank you. Tom, last sentence.
I mean, I'd just say that I think farming businesses are very well positioned to deliver a huge amount of services that society requires, but we need to have thriving farming, profitable businesses that can deliver the food outcomes and the non-food outcomes alongside it.
Thank you. Dustin?
I've talked a lot about numbers, but I want to finish on something which is very non-numerical, and that's the idea of pride. I think the 20th century, you were proud if you were a farmer because you maximized output, you were feeding the world. For the 21st century, it's a way more complicated story. It's how do I sustain food production for the long time whilst restoring the natural world so that we can all enjoy it. And that, I think, is the shared endeavor we all need to take away from this.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, I'd like to just finish with a note of optimism, you know, in that our community's gone from one farmer to 150 and one customer to over 1,000, and we can now measure the holistic nature consequences of farming differently. We can quantify them, we can value them. None of this is easy, but creating a collective sense of mission, getting a holistic sense of farm economics so that farmers aren't only rewarded for yield, but for its quality and how it's grown. It's all there. We know how to do it, and if we choose to do it, we can make it happen.
Thank you, thank you. And the note of optimism from me is eight years ago, as I said at the start, we are told you can't talk about land, don't talk about land, it's too difficult, too contested. And yet, on the platform right now, we've got leaders representing a real diversity of organisations. We've got a pretty full tent, and in the consultation process that we were just involved in, we had standing room only in communities of people wanting to talk about land and land use decisions. Now, for me, that is a win. One of the most precious resources we've got available to us, and now people want to talk about it. People see it, want to talk about it, and want to work through the issues. That feels like something to be really optimistic and excited about. Thank you, my brilliant panel, for bringing that to the floor.